Greetings all, and welcome to part 2 of my Revell F4U-4 Corsair double build. In this episode I'll continue working on Hudner and Brown's aircraft by painting them, adding some custom decals, and preparing the models for a bit of weathering. So without further ado, let's get into some painting. The first paint I would apply would be for the white unit markings on the top of both Corsairs' tails. I first masked the edges of the bands off with Tamiya masking tape to reduce any overspray. Then I mixed 3 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver with 3 drops of Vallejo Model Air Insignia flat white and sprayed this onto the top parts of the tails, building it up gradually. Once the white had then had a few hours to dry and cure, I then removed the masking tape from below it and used it to mask off the white and mixed up 10 drops of acrylic flow improver, a drop of Vallejo paint retardant to prevent tip drying, and 10 drops of Model Air US Navy Glossy Sea Blue. Once mixed up, I then began to paint the underside of the first Corsair, building the paint up gradually in many passes until the underside was a uniform glossy sea blue. Spraying the glossy sea blue onto black primer is a bit of a challenge since both colours are so dark, though I was very reluctant to use a white primer as in most photos I've seen the glossy sea blue can be so dark it almost appears black. It also seems to have a bluish but sometimes green tone depending on the photo, and the Vallejo paint seemed to capture this quite well depending on the lighting. Once the first Corsair was painted, I then sat it aside and painted the second Corsair's underside. By the time the second Corsair had been painted, the first Corsair was touch dry underneath, so I mixed up some more paint, turned over the first aircraft, and sprayed the top side in the same manner, once again repeating this process on the second Corsair when the first one was done. To create some subtle variation and fading in some spots, I then mixed up 7 drops of flow improver with 5 drops of glossy sea blue and 2 drops of faded PRU blue to create a lighter bluish colour. This was then sprayed onto the fabric areas and control surfaces, along with the middle of several panels on the upper surface of the wings, and along the fuselage sides, focusing the paint more heavily on the upper surface. This was a bit too subtle and I wanted a more saturated colour rather than more of a blue, so I mixed up 8 drops of flow improver with 6 drops of sea blue and this time 2 drops of insignia white. This produced a much stronger effect that I was happy with, so I applied this in the same spots like the fabric surfaces as well as on the upper fuselage, especially behind the engine area. The effect on both Corsairs ended up very strong, so to soften this I blended it in with another coat of the glossy sea blue. And with the post shading done and softened, I then removed the masking on the white markings and gave the paint a few more hours to cure, and in the meantime applied several coats of Vallejo Model Colour Flat Black onto the propeller and Model Air Insignia White onto the spinner using a brush. I built these colours up gradually in several layers, keeping the paint nice and thin by using some water. The tyres on the Corsair were also painted with the Model Colour Flat Black, and for the landing gear struts and wheel hubs, I decided to go with Vallejo Model Colour 70997 Silver. This was a bit more of a dull bare metal silver that was less shiny than the Model Air silvers I would have previously used. I painted around about 2 coats carefully onto the wheel hubs and the strut for the main wheels and tail wheel based on reference photos. With the final coat of black done on the propellers, I then painted the tips of the blades with some Vallejo Model Colour Pink to serve as a base coat for the yellow, and gave the wheels some more touch-ups while the pink dried. Vallejo Model Colour Flat Yellow was then applied in just 2 coats, and as you can see, the pink really makes the yellow pop and a lot easier to apply. With most of the painting done, I was almost ready to move on to the decals, but first I sprayed both Corsairs and their propellers with some Vallejo Gloss Varnish, thinned to a ratio of 1 drop of flow improver for 1 drop of varnish. This would not only protect the water-based paints when applying decals and handling the model, but also provide a glossy surface for the decals to prevent any silvering. I gave the varnish 12 hours to fully cure before I then started preparing the decals. For the markings, I decided to use GIMP and some downloaded fonts and images to make my own markings for White 205 and 211. 205 is the aircraft from VF32 that Tom Hudner ditched, and 211 is an aircraft Jesse Brown is known to have flown, and I believe the one that he also ditched as well. Once designed, I then had them printed by Michael from Laser Shark Designs, and I was really happy with the quality that he achieved with them. They aren't pre-cut like off-the-shelf kit decals are, so they had to be individually cut out, and I really should have done a neater job of this and tried to have as little clear film on each decal as possible, but they still worked out okay. The only kit decals I would end up using would be the Hamilton standard logos for the propellers, the anti-skid marks on the wings, and the fuel info on the upper fuselages. The decals from Laser Shark were easy to apply, and even when I accidentally folded them up a little bit, they didn't disintegrate, so they are much better than anything Mr. Craft has come up with. They are slightly transparent, so I probably should have done an extra white decal to use as a backing, since I was applying them onto a very dark surface, which meant that the red was a little bit saturated on the star and bar. Overall though, I was still really impressed by them, and would definitely recommend Laser Shark decals if you have a need for custom markings that you're happy to design yourself. Once applied, I gave all of the decals the usual treatment of Vallejo decal softener and Tamiya decal adhesive to help them sink into the surface details of the model, and after giving the decals 12 hours to set, I did another coat of glossy varnish to protect the decals, and blend everything together with the gloss finish that the post-war Corsairs would have had. I once again let everything cure for 12 hours, and then I got out some matte varnish and used a brush to apply this onto the propeller blades, tail wheel, and the main landing gear. This would give them a more accurate matte dull finish, unlike the glossy finish of the paint. 2 coats of varnish were applied, thinned down with water for a smooth finish. With all of the airbrushing done, I removed the blue tack from the engine and cockpit areas. For 205, I attempted drilling out a hole since the pin had broken earlier for fitting the propeller, but I didn't want to damage the engine, so ended up leaving it for the moment. I made a second attempt at the vacform canopies, which I'd cut out off camera, and then painted the frames of with 2 coats of interior green to match the cockpit and create the framework colour for the inside of the canopy. Once the interior green had dried, I then applied 2 coats of the USN Glossy Sea Blue for the exterior colour. Both of these colours were also used to touch up the areas where the masking had been around the cockpit. Since I'd used acrylic paints for the canopies, I could then use a cocktail stick to very gently scratch away any mistakes and neaten up the edges of the canopy frames before then gluing the front windshield for both Corsairs to their fuselage. For this I used some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue, since this glue acts pretty fast and doesn't fog up the clear parts. Unfortunately, the windscreens fitted quite poorly, and while part of this is how the kit is designed and is somewhat present with the kit's original canopy, the other seems to be still me getting the hang of the vacuforming and making molds. I'd basically taken the kit's original canopies to use as a mold and filled them up with milliput, but these molds needed the edges to be trimmed down to make the edge of the canopy frames more defined to make it easier cutting them out. I decided to address this later after doing the weathering, which is what we'll be covering next time in part 3. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did and you've been enjoying watching my Corsair build series, then please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and feel free to politely leave any helpful advice or any experiences you've had building these kits in the comments below. A massive thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who help to fund not only me buying these kits, but also the products I use to make them and the time I spend making these videos. Without you guys, the channel wouldn't be able to keep going, so thank you so much. I'm hoping to have part 3 ready in the next week, but there may be some slight delays as I'm working on some special little upgrades for these kits, which I'll be 3D printing, and also doing a bit more work on the vacuform canopies. So all going well, it will be ready in a week, otherwise I'll have another build video ready to go as a substitute. That's it for now, but until the next video, as always, take care and model on.